Hi, I'm Jan Risher. I'm the editor of Louisiana Inspired and the Louisiana culture editor for the Times-Picayune and the Advocate, the Acadiana Advocate, and the Shreveport-Bossier City Advocate also. That's a mouthful. And we are so glad that you're here with us to discuss Eudora Welty's The Optimist's Daughter. I read this book initially when I was in the 9th grade at my high school in Mississippi. And I've loved it ever since. And I'm just so glad that today we've got a panel, a small panel of experts. And we'll start with Dr. Gary Richards. Dr. Richards is a professor of English at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I'll get it out. And he teaches courses in U.S. fiction and drama. He's the author of the book Lovers and Beloved, Sexual Otherness in Southern Fiction, as well as numerous essays on Southern writers such as William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, Beth Henley, and Eudora Welty. Welcome, Dr. Richards.
Thanks so much, Jan.
And secondly, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Kambonga. Elizabeth is the Eudora Welty collection curator at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Glad to be here.
And I'll tell a quick story before we get into the real discussion. I had been in conversation with the Welty House in Jackson, Mississippi about having someone from them represented on the panel discussion. And they emailed me and said that they would like to have Elizabeth be a part of it. And I said, well, that is great because I remember the day she was born. She happened to be the daughter of my best friend my senior year in high school, and we were cheerleaders to get together, go Trojans. So welcome, Elizabeth. So glad you're here. But I think that we're going to get kicked off here with Gary, if you don't mind talking a little bit about your connection to Eudora Welty and this book in particular.
Sure. I had the realization when I did some math that I have been thinking about and writing about Eudora Welty for about 33 years. I did my undergraduate honors thesis on Welty's novel, Losing Battles. It was the novel she was working on simultaneously with The Optimist's Daughter. I went on to do my graduate work at Vanderbilt, where I had the good fortune to work with Michael Kraling, who was one of the first scholars to really champion Eudora Welty. And so I have been teaching her and writing about her ever since. I teach her routinely in Southern literature classes. I teach her in American fiction classes. I just finished teaching last week her short story, The Wide Net, which students absolutely loved. We put it in dialogue with John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. And then most recently, I did a senior seminar putting Welty in dialogue with Zora Neale Hurston. I think they really have emerged as two of the most important 20th century Southern women writers. And that was really fun to see kind of that dialogue. I think of Welty primarily as a short story writer. That was what her original fame was from. But I think it's good that we remember her novels. Of her novels, the one that I personally feel the most love towards is The Optimist's Daughter. I think it is a brilliant representation and anatomy of death, loss, grief, and an individualized response to all of those elements. Welty was writing this as she was going through a period of incredible loss in her own life. For those of you who know much about Welty's biography, you may already know that in 1966, she lost her mother and her closest brother within a matter of about 4 days, just devastating to Welty. And so this is a novel that I think was therapeutic for her in the writing, but it's also therapeutic for readers. So I have often recommended this novel to people as a good read if you're negotiating loss, etc. It is simultaneously hilarious. There are some wonderful representations of white trash that make me smile every time I read them, but then it's also incredibly poignant. So I'm delighted to get to talk with you all about it.
Well, thank you so much. Elizabeth, would you like to give us a little bit of your background on how you became a Welty expert?
Sure. I think what is the greatest connection that I have with Welty is being from Mississippi, traveling to New York and trying to make it work in New York City, and then feeling the tug to come back to Mississippi constantly. When I read that in her biography and When Writer's Beginnings, I was like, wow, I can really connect with that on a very deep level. So that's my background. I went to New York City for my undergraduate degree, spent some time abroad, made my way into grad school with a master in library and information science, moved back to Mississippi during the height of the pandemic, and found my way in Jackson, and they were hiring. So I'm very fortunate to be working with the Eudora Welty collection. I first read Welty in high school at the Mississippi School of the Arts. We read The Robber Bridegroom, and most of the time when I tell people that, they say, "Are you okay?" That is a very tough book to read in high school. But I was just fascinated by it. So that was the first book that I read on my own. My mom read A Warm Path to me when I was younger, but it really didn't resonate with me until I had moved back to Mississippi and I saw all of the pride that Jackson has for Welty in the city. So I've been at MDAH since 2021. And I work as an archivist here. I help process the Welty collection. We still receive materials from the Welty estate from time to time. Right now, the collection is comprised of 45 series. It is one of the largest literary collections in the world. In the United States, it is one of the most intact literary collections because Welty specifically wanted to donate all of her materials here. She had a close connection with the Department of Archives and History. One of her best friends, Charlotte Capers, was the first female director of MDAH. I love their letters. They often signed their letters "Love Dodo" or "Love Cha-Cha." They had a great relationship. And it was because of Charlotte Capers that we have all of these materials here, as well as her house. That's my connection.
I have a question for you. What is, in your time there, what is the most, the one piece in the archives that really just makes your heart sing?
Well, the first series of the collection that I was tasked to work on was the opening of the family papers. These papers were sealed for 20 years after Welty's death, and no one had ever seen them except for me. And I got to read Eudora Welty's parents' correspondence to each other as they were courting each other. And I think that is just one of the greatest treasures that we have in the Welty collection, because you can see the progression of her parents' love for each other over the years, their support for Eudora as she is growing up, and then the connection between mother and daughter is just really great.
Well, I think that everything that y'all have said is a great segue into the book. And I will say this, I read the book years ago and I listened to it mostly. I read and listened, but she is the narrator of the book on Audible, and I got a call on Monday, well, the day before the election. What would that have been? November the 4th. And my dearest uncle they didn't think he was going to make it through the night. And so I needed to come home. And so I get in my car, I'm driving to Mississippi, and I think, oh, this will be a great time to listen to The Optimist Daughter. And so I did, and just the lilt of the cadence of her voice is so familiar to me, being from, basically 35, 40 miles from where she grew up. And she sounds like my aunts and grandmother, and then just, of course, the topic and that, as you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, that pull of coming home. And I got there that Monday night, got to be with my uncle, and he died early the next morning. And then I just stayed because his funeral wasn't until Thursday. And y'all, here in 2024, the rhythm of the Mississippi funeral hasn't changed a lot. So it was really heartening in a lot of ways. It was good. So let's talk for a moment about grief and the theme of grief and letting go in the book. I know that there are so many references. That's really what the book is about. And as you mentioned, Gary, that's where she was when she was writing it. But in just terms of the theme, and do either of you have a favorite quote about it, or want to talk more about the way that she navigates the story and that theme? Gary, you want to start?
Sure. I think that what Welty does so brilliantly here is document the necessity of the public rituals of grief. When the family gathers at the house, when the body of Judge McKelvey is brought in, going to the church for the funeral service, going to the cemetery, even though it's in the new part of the cemetery, which is horrifying to Laurel to think about her father. And with the roar of the interstate and those tacky plastic poinsettias that have been left there. And even going back then to the house afterwards for the communal eating and things like that. So the importance of it, but also I think Welty underscores the frustrations of it. Laurel becomes so anxious at the misrepresentations of her father, that everyone is telling a different story, often to make them the hero of that story. So I think that's what goes on really in parts 2 and 3. And then it's only in part 4 where Welty says what really, in my opinion, matters is the private rituals. That's the night that Laurel goes through her mother's things, her father's things like that, and thinks about what is our relationship of memory to objects. And the most famous object, of course, is at the very end of the novel, the breadboard. The breadboard that unites Laurel's husband, Philip Hand, who has died tragically, unexpectedly in World War II, and her mother. He had made the board for Becky, who makes this wonderful bread. And Laurel has been able to shuck off all of the other trappings of materialism until she sees the breadboard. And that's her struggle, is how do we come to terms? What are the items we keep? What are the items that we don't keep? Laurel ultimately gives up the breadboard. And I think Welty uses, this is on page 179, very famous passage. Memory lived not in initial possession, but in the freed hands, pardoned and freed, and in the heart that can empty but fill again, in the patterns restored by dreams. So I think she's advocating, among other things there, how we shuck off our need for the physical to remember people and just rely upon memory. So I think it's just in our age of materialism, where we have houses filled with stuff, Welty's message really resonates for me. So I think she guides us in this novel for both the rituals of public grief, but also private grief.
In that same vein, what do you, in contrast to the breadboard, what do you think about the soapstone boat gift? I mean,
it's that she attempts to give it to Miss Adele, thinking we often want, for someone whom we love, we want to give things to others whom we love. But there is that freedom that I love about Miss Adele, that she gives it back. And so that's the one item that Laurel ultimately has. But again, just as the breadboard united her husband and her mother, that is the object that unites her parents. Elizabeth, as you were talking about those wonderful letters between Christian and Chestina, if I remember correctly, the soapstone is the stone that Judge McKelva picks up for Becky to sharpen her pens on. So it unites the two. So it's almost, I think, Welty licensing. Yes, sometimes we do want to have small things as keepsakes.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think what I love about this story is how autobiographical it is. Even though there are several differences, there is a large connection with Welty's house. And when I read The Optimist Daughter for the first time, I imagined the Welty house at 1119 Pinehurst Street because it's uncanny. She talks about the secretary desk with the pigeonholes that is sitting in Welty's room today. Those letters from her parents were not burned, but they were kept. They almost were burned, but they were kept, thankfully. The set of the Charles Dickens novels, those are at the Welty house. They were Chestina's sets that she rescued from a fire. She had I think the house or apartment that they were living on was on fire. She had received that set from her father. They came in a barrel down the river. She had gone and rescued those, and they're charred and burned from that fire. We have the river stone with the initials of Christian Welty. So there's a lot of connections there. The clock on the mantle. I think about her photos that she took in New Orleans around Mardi Gras. I'm visualizing all of these different elements that are part of Welty's life that she was seeing and experiencing and wrapping it up into one novel.
Why do you guys think that she chose to start the book in New Orleans? Gary?
New Orleans, it's not just New Orleans, it's New Orleans during Mardi Gras. So right. If we are looking for an extended metaphor for chaos, we think about death being so associated for Laurel and for her father and for Faye. This is the chaoticness of it. I had the good fortune to work at the University of New Orleans for 11 years. I was not from Southern Louisiana, and it blew my mind the way New Orleans parties during Mardi Gras. It's not one day, it is 3 weeks, And so just that constant sense of it never stops. You're on the parade route again and again. And so I think there is that sense kind of larger that Laurel is just discombobulated. It also, though, creates that disjunct between what's going on in the larger world and the sterility of the hospital. that Welty really emphasizes the harsh lights, the lack of warmth there. So I think New Orleans is very symbolic. And one other way I would say is that you've got the Mississippi River in this book forming kind of an axis, so that Mount Solace, if we take it as loosely a representation of Jackson, is going to be between New Orleans to the south at the end of the river, and of course Chicago, much more associated with the beginning of the river, and that Laurel is going between those two. So I think it's a brilliant choice. And we know that Welty had a real fondness for New Orleans. If you're looking for other Welty stories, No Place for You, My Love is a fantastic story that Welty wrote, one of her later ones, that deals with a couple leaving the city and going down to Venice in kind of the marshlands. So that's my take.
Well, I also it's a oops, we're having feedback here, John. I'm not sure what's going on. Can you guys hear me okay now? I also think that, you know, in Mississippi, in small town Mississippi, when we think about wild, I mean, New Orleans is the go-to place, you know. What do you think was Welty's thought process in terms of making it not only New Orleans, and not only did Faye get to enjoy Mardi Gras like she wanted, but it was also, you know, her birthday. I mean, let's talk about Faye. Here's a big question. How do you think that, I mean, we could just speculate here, but how would it be written differently today if Welty were writing this story? Do you think that she would go as hardcore white trash?
I will proudly proclaim that there's a lot of white trash still around, and I know that's a politically incorrect term, but I think that it is more what Welty was trying to explore was two different classes responding to grief. And so there are still Fays. I have Fays in my family and you ask about it being Faye's birthday. Well, we often associate birthdays with a day that focuses on ourselves. Oh, it's my birthday. I mean, Faye is a monster of egotism. Everything is about her. So she can't stand that the judge has to lie immobile. She's the one who shakes him because she's bored and indirectly leads to his death. So I suspect, you know, a writer today would still use that sort of image. And there is a way that Welty even redeems Faye. There is I'm forgetting his name now. It's one of Faye's relatives, like the young boy who is, let me see if I can find it. I may not be able to now. Wendell. Wendell, Laurel thinks is like Faye before she turned into this monster. And that he's a very sympathetic character. So I think Welty both is beautifully satirizing that class of people, but she also is not dismissing them. As when the middle-class women the day after the funeral are in the backyard gardening, one of them says, you know, Faye was behaving and rising to the occasion exactly the way she was expected to. I mean, so there is a way she was doing what her culture expected of her.
Elizabeth, do you want to?
Not so much about Faye. I don't think there's a lot of great things to say about Faye, but I just find her as a comical character because she's so ridiculous. But I will go back to the point about New Orleans, why it begins in New Orleans. During that time, or during Welty's time where she was losing her family members, New Orleans was the place to go for healthcare, because Mississippi is so small, town-minded. I mean, like, there wasn't that care. You'd have to go to New Orleans for that. So I think that also Welty was spending a lot of time in New Orleans when her brothers, I believe one of her brothers had broken his neck. He had to be rushed to New Orleans. Her mother experienced a lot of eye problems later in life, which that's another connection there. I mean, Christian only lived until 1931, and Eudora had just finished college at that point. So he died when she was quite young. And I think that she wanted to explore that in some roundabout way, a relationship of what it would be like later in life with her dad versus with her mom. But as far as Faye, yeah, there's not much to say about her.
I absolutely love that she has the coffin draped in the pink fabric that matches the bedroom, Laurel's parents' bedroom that she's had redone. Just those are the comic touches that I think are brilliant.
It feels very much like Why I Live at the PO, the sister, just like a character that's just so comedic,
Yeah,
but awful.
I would think that it'd be a lot of fun to write for Eudora Welty, the comedy parts of that for sure. All right, switching gears for a moment, because we don't have a whole lot of time, but let's talk about birds. There's so many bird references in the book. Elizabeth, you want to go first?
Yeah, Welty has a lot of connection with birds in all of her works, I would say. That is something we've actually been exploring in our Welty House book club that we do virtually. But I don't have a real answer. Maybe Gary could speak more on that. I know there's also a big connection with flowers and gardens. That is present all throughout Welty's correspondence. As well when she's talking to her friends about flowers. So she's very heavily invested in that. Yeah, I would hand that off to Gary about the birds.
Sure. I think probably the most noted image is going to be towards the end of the novel when Laurel is there spending that kind of traumatic night. And there is a chimney swift that has gotten loose in the house, and it's flitting around, and there is one kind of folklore that it's bad luck for a bird to be in the house. So, but it's also, I would say, looping us back to New Orleans. It's a different kind of chaos. Again, as I was saying earlier about public rituals and private rituals, the chaos of Mardi Gras is the public. A bird in the house is more individualized. It's Laurel and that bird kind of struggling with one another. And I think that it is not unlike Faye. You know, that it is something that has interloped into this house that doesn't belong there. And when Missouri comes in the next morning, she just gets the bird, takes it out, and says, you know, a cat's going to get it, and that's the end of it.
Right.
One thing that I did think about with Faye that I think she represents is, unlike with Welty, who had a very close family, both with her parents and with her brothers, her sisters-in-laws, her nieces, what Faye represents is our lack of control of family. Judge McKelville remarries late in his life, brings in someone who is much younger. Faye is younger than Laurel in the novel.
Right.
And so then we're back to materialism. They fight over who's going to get the house. And the neighbors are complaining, why is this woman going to live next to us? So I think the bird is a little bit like like Faye, this intrusive interloper that isn't wanted.
And then I also, and we're going to get, some people are submitting questions, and you're welcome to do so, and we will give those to the experts here. But I also thought that the mourning dove references were interesting and kind of a theme throughout. And then I don't have it in front of me either, but when Laurel is talking about the birds on the river that are flying over, I'll find that quote in a moment. But let's go right now to Lisa Fennell's question, and it is, I'll read it exactly. Do you think Laurel wonders why her father chose Faye as a partner? What do you think, Gary?
Of course, there is. If you're interested in this topic and you're thinking about Southern literature, I would recommend Peter Taylor's A Summons to Memphis. It's a novel that asks, why do old widowed men decide to marry young things and disrupt the family? So even though this was not Welty's experience, it is a real pattern in Southern culture and the way that it disrupts. So of course, I think Laurel is concerned about that. She largely, I think once she goes to Chicago, she wants to freeze her family, mother, father, the way they were. And I think we often want to do that with, we want to have our childhood frozen. And the novel says, no, our parents have lives beyond us. And Judge McKelvey met this tacky woman and married her. She didn't even cook breakfast for him.
As a judge, he wasn't that great of a judge of character.
Yes, the irony. Great point, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, do you have anything you wanted to add about the Lisa's question?
I'm not sure why he would, especially I don't know. It's an odd topic because Welty did not experience this with her parents, and I've often wondered that as well. Like, why is her dad marrying this younger woman? It's just one of those mysteries to me that is pondering. I ponder a lot. So, yeah.
I will add on page 116, this is when the ladies, the middle-class ladies, are gossiping the day after. And Miss Adele says, she's never done anybody any harm. Rather, she gave a lonely old man something to live for. I'd rather not consider how, interrupted Miss Tennyson primly. So an old man, you know, having his sexual fling, and most of us don't like to think about our parents in that position, so to speak.
That's a good point.
All right, moving on. So, you know, Welty had a lot of choices of whose daughter this book could have been named for. You know, she chose the Optimist. I thought a lot about, you know, where, like, why do you think that she made that choice? Was it just the, because he had been this good man? I mean, do you think he really was an optimist?
I know that Welty references her father as an optimist, and that her mother was more daring. So I think it's more of a connection with her own father at this point. It's been several months since I've read the book, so I can't think off of the top of my head if he does seem like an optimist in the book. I don't really recall that much, except during his whole procedure. But also, Welty's father was practical. He was a practical-minded individual. Chestina, Welty's mother, encouraged Welty to write. And while Christian encouraged Welty to be creative, he wanted her to go to business school for her graduate degree. So I don't know, maybe he was more realistic in that sense.
What do you think, Gary?
I read the novel as pretty heavily saturated in irony. that as Elizabeth has suggested, Judge McKelvey and Becky were kind of mirrors of Welty's parents, but as suggested, Judge McKelvey doesn't show much optimism. After he's had the surgery, he just kind of lies there, checked out when Laurel is reading to him, etc. And so the way I've often read this is, if we go back to these rituals, the rituals of death, the rituals of how people change, it's often not only just the physical death, but the change in personalities. And Elizabeth, you can probably speak more to this, but from what I've read, as Chestina Andrews Welty aged, like many old people, she became very critical, very violent. She had to be put in a nursing home at one point and guilted Welty, who was visiting multiple times a week. And so that there's almost this sense of, if Welty is anatomizing the process of death, death is relatively easy. It is how people we love transform in ways we don't expect. And I think that makes, for me, the title very ironic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think closer to Chestina's death, we see evidence in the correspondence where Welty is struggling very much with Chestina, especially her eyes. She kept losing her vision, and that caused a lot of the anger and outbursts. So yeah, another interesting thing about that is that when Welty would visit her mother, she would write in the car while driving.
Oh.
because she was visiting so often. That was I mean, I don't recommend doing it. Thankfully we have recording devices these days, but it just fascinates me, like, how dedicated she was to her writing, that she was going through this difficult time with her mother, visiting her as often as she could, and just writing on a notepad while driving.
One other thing, one of the quotes that got me, it's early in the book, was about Dr. Cortland. She said, "I could see Mississippi in him, and the old people, the old town, the old house." And whenever I read that, and then I listened to Eudora read that, I mean, I understood, I know in my mind exactly what that is describing. And I started thinking about, so I lived in Mississippi for the first 23 years of my life. I've now lived in Louisiana for 23 years. And I lived in Nevada, lived in Virginia, and lived in Texas. And like, I started thinking, could I substitute other states in that and have as clear of an image? And certainly I could for Louisiana. But I think that this book does such a great job of sense of place. And, you know, there at the very end, there was, whenever Laurel is leaving and she says, there's a couple pages earlier, they describe someone with that fast teacher walk. Like, I know exactly what that is. But just the last paragraph, the last thing Laurel saw before they whirled into speed was the twinkling of their hands, with many small and unknown hands wishing her goodbye. And like, I have seen that on Mississippi playgrounds. I've probably seen that on Texas playgrounds, but just the way that Welty captures a sense of place is so powerful to me. Elizabeth, you grew up in Mississippi. Did you have that same, do you have a vision of, I could see Mississippi in him, and what that means? Yes.
I think, like you, Jan, I've lived in several other states, and the way that Welty portrays Mississippians, it wouldn't work. I think but she does a great job of bringing in Faye's family from Texas, and you see that big difference there as well. A Texas Southerner is very different than a Mississippi Southerner.
And I can't say that Faye's family is indicative of a lot of Texas Southerners.
So yeah, I think there's a certain quality that Welty portrays her characters that could only work in Mississippi. I would agree with that.
Gary, what do you think?
As a person who's been thinking about Southern culture for 30 years, I want to push back a little bit on Southern exceptionalism. The South likes to think of itself as, oh, we're unique. Well, there are multiple Souths and multiple Mississippis and, you know, multiple Jacksons, etc. What I think Welty does in this novel and her other fiction is she is such a keen observer and relayer of details. So I think she could be writing about Utah and Welty could make it have a sense of place. I think that what she has with Jackson, Mississippi and kind of that state is she has that familiarity. At this point, you know, she had 60 years almost of living in that culture and the detail that she has. So I don't think it's so much the location as the author.
I totally agree, by the way. I do. And and that's kind of where I was trying to go with that. Like, you know, how to translate. I could see Mississippi in him too. I could see Louisiana in him, you know, and like, what are the things that would build, that she would use if she were observing that?
I think that's also a kind of commentary on Laurel's personality. Just like she wants to freeze her parents kind of in the past, she knows Nate Cortland as the guy she wrote. So she sees Mississippi. What she's not seeing necessarily is, oh, he's a famous optical surgeon living in New Orleans. He has a wife who speaks French, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's almost that she sees that small town in him and not the person he has become once he left that community.
So interesting. Yeah, that's a great observation. I really appreciate you guys joining us. And I appreciate all the listeners and watchers out there and readers. And I will announce our next book. We go back and forth from fiction to nonfiction, even though I personally, fiction comes a lot easier for me in terms of reading full books because I edit nonfiction all the time. But this is going to be our next book. It's Lisa Marie Presley and her daughter Riley Keoph's From Here to the Great Unknown. It's Lisa Marie's biography, or sorry, her memoir, I should say, not a biography, but her memoir. And I am really excited to read and discuss it and look forward to doing that. We'll probably have the discussion second week in March. We'll announce an exact date coming up. But Gary and Elizabeth, I certainly hope that you guys will join us again sometime when we have another great Southern novel to discuss. And Elizabeth, do you want to tell folks how they could visit the Welty House?
Yes, you can come here at Jackson, Mississippi. 1119 Pinehurst Street is the Welty House Museum and Garden. If you want to do research on Welty, you can visit the William F. Winter Archives and History Building, and we have Welty's entire works here. We have also digitized a portion, I'll say, of Welty collection materials. You can view the drafts of The Optimist Daughter online by visiting our website at mdah.ms.gov. You can also view correspondence and photographs that Welty took. So we have all of those here. We don't have everything digitized though, so.
Working on it. Well, Gary, I hope that the rest of your semester wraps up well. I know you're in the throes of exams, and we appreciate you taking the time away from that to be here with us today. And you just both added a lot to this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you guys. Happy reading.
Thank you, Jen.
Bye-bye.